G'day everyone, it is winter in Australia and my Ram is filthy, it's covered in mud because that's what it is where I live at the moment. We're having a wet winter and this is a good time to talk about the four-wheel drive capability of North American vehicles. Now this is my Ram 3500 I've had for a good few years now, and I've also had an F250, one of the Australian variants that was brought in the early 2000s by Ford Australia, and the experience that I've had with both of those vehicles are pretty much the same. Now I'm not talking necessarily about taking my Ram or Effie four-wheel driving. What I'm talking about is I'm a farmer and I use these things on the farm, so my four-wheel drive experience is primarily restricted or limited to that. Because I'm not really looking to go four-wheel driving with this thing, and I will tell you why in this video. So most of the North American utility vehicles that come into Australia, particularly those that are sold in volume, so think the Ram 1500, the 2500 and 3500 by ASV, and then people like SCD and others, Performax, bringing in vehicles in volume. Pretty much all of them by default are the four-wheel drive variant. Now, not through SCD, I don't believe. I think they only bring in the 4x4 variants. But if you speak to some of the other more specialty importing houses, they will, I believe, bring you in a 4x2 if you want to. Now, would you do the 4x2? Well, the 4x2 can save you some money and it can look like it makes some sense, particularly because of the price difference. But if you're bringing one of these things in for towing and towing alone on bitumen, it may look like it makes some sense to bring in the 4x2 and save some money. I would suggest historically that has not really panned out great for those that have done it, because the depreciation rates on the 4x2 variants have traditionally been poorer than their 4x4 compatriots. So if you have a look, for example, in the early 2000s when Ford was bringing in the F250 and F350, a lot of the F350s, in fact most if not all of them, were 4x2 models, or a couple of 4x4s, but a lot of them were 4x2s because a lot of them got turned into ambulances. And they'd have the ambulance box on the back of it. And when they came up for sale, either the ambulance box was removed, a lot of them ended up in the Australian military and defence force as well, and the rear was removed and they were sold as a cab chassis. A few of them were sold with the ambulance back on them, and some have remained, and a lot of them have been taken off and they've put a steel tray or a tub on the back of them. And when they started hitting the market, they were selling at a fairly hefty discount to the F250 that was same, not dualies, I'm not talking about single rear wheel. They were selling it at quite a considerable discount to their 4x4 F250 competitors. And the F250, the F350 has a larger GVM, so it should be more attractive, but the lack of four-wheel drive really didn't make it that appealing to a lot of buyers. So they had a lower value like for like with the F250s. And we've seen that across other variants as well, the 4x2s as opposed to 4x4s. Now, in recent years, we have seen the emergence of the so-called high rider, single cab, space cab, dual cab, Australian type utilities. So that's a new development. We see more and more of those people who want the ride height, they want the look of the four-wheel drive, but they don't actually intend on doing any four-wheel driving. So they've become more popular. So that might change people's approach to considering a 4x2 vehicle. My brother did the high rider thing in a Ford Ranger a few years ago, and it was fine. He used less fuel, he didn't go off-road, it was perfectly fine for his uses. However, he did find it quite difficult to sell because everyone wanted the four-wheel drive and no one wanted the high rider. And generally, some well-meaning person would contact him and say, "Oh, seems like a cheap price. What's wrong with it?" "Nothing's wrong with it." "Oh, hang on a minute, it's not four-wheel drive." "No, it's the 4x2. "Oh, right, no, I want the 4x4. So anyway, that may change people's attitudes, because indeed, if all you do is tow on bitumen, you might not need 4x4. In fact, you probably won't ever use it. If you're only driving on bitumen, you won't ever use it. So it's something to keep in mind, but the majority of what's brought in is 4x4. So that's a long preamble, but anyway, so with this, you've got to keep in mind that I run a number of vehicles for my staff and such on the farm. And this year, you know, I've been out on the tractor today spraying, and we're starting to get very, very selective on where we go and where we drive and where we don't drive, because we don't want to get bogged. There's starting to get some boggy parts, and it's no fun having to, you know, dig a piece of farm machinery, or the long walk of shame home after you get your ute bogged in the paddock. That's not really much fun. So, and I got to say up front, like, I drive a lot on dirt, as you can tell. And I have, you know, a long, you know, about 10-kilometre run of dirt roads into town. I have 2 kilometres of driveway as well to navigate. All of that's dirt. So I do a lot on dirt roads. That's the first thing. How does it go on a dirt road? Like, if the dirt road is solid and it's not greasy, it's fine. The problem is when it's raining, it can get a bit slick. And this is the long wheelbase version. So it's got the long box on the back of it, and the back end is very light. And it has a tendency to get a little bit loose in the back end, particularly if you're going down hills, and that can get a little bit slick or a little bit loose underneath you. It gets a bit slimy and greasy, and the back end can have a tendency to step out. So you just want to keep an eye on it. It's not the most well handling thing there. So, you know, modern traction aids does eliminate that a little bit, but still it's not dissimilar to anything that I've owned previously that has a very light back end. So this is a long box, so it's a long amount of vehicle, very, very heavy in the front end, very light in the back end. You would expect that the back end would step out, and it gets to the point sometimes where I know that the road's going to be slick, and I just put it in four-wheel drive before I go out on dirt and drive the whole time on a dirt road with four-wheel drive to try and keep some semblance of, you know, keeping on the straight and narrow, as it were. But I mean, that's true of, you know, I had a Ford Ranger years ago, and it had an aluminium tray, and it was just a nightmare. It was forever getting grass bogged. It always had a tendency to step out. There just wasn't enough weight over the rear wheels, and it was okay. We made it work, but, you know, all things considering, it needed more weight over the back wheels to keep it planted. So, you know, when you know, that's the first thing. Just on that, it gets a little bit loose, because I see a lot of people saying, you know, the four-wheel drive capacity of these things is unreal. And like, it's not bad. It has four-wheel drive. It has a genuine transfer case with low range. And I found that that's got me out of trouble. I've never actually got this bogged. But most of the reason I've never got it bogged is because I don't go anywhere that I get a little bit worried about it sinking. And I'll come to the reason why. But so most of the time when I go out on the paddocks in wintertime, I will almost always drive my Hilux. It's light, like it's over a ton lighter than this thing. And, you know, and if I've got to go somewhere that's really boggy, as long as it's not, you know, pouring rain and freezing cold, I'll jump in the John Deere Gator. I've got a John Deere Gator. It weighs about 750 kilos, and it'll go anywhere without getting bogged. It's absolutely phenomenal. I have bogged it a couple of times, but it has to be really, really, really wet, and you've really gone somewhere you had no business going to get that thing stuck. So you can get across a lot of parts of the paddocks and fields in the lighter vehicle than certainly what you can with this. So I'm pretty cautious on where I drive with this thing. And when it gets greasy, as I said, it can have a tendency to step out even with four-wheel drive engaged. So most of the time when I'm going across paddocks, I'll do it in the Hilux. The other reason is that even driving out the driveway, because this thing is so light at the back end, and it's got such a powerful engine, so much weight over the front end, it can have a tendency to lose grip, and it doesn't take long to lose grip for you to dig yourself a trench, and then you've got something to clean up later on. It can tear up your driveway. If you drive onto your lawn to wash your car down and wash all the water and dirt back onto the lawn again, you can tear your lawn to pieces coming off it again if you're not careful. You know, it's a heavy vehicle, and it can sink quite rapidly. So most of my driving around the farm is in the Hilux. Now, I acknowledge that some people say, I have great four-wheel driving capability, and people that have got even older Rams than this who are back into the second gen, oh, it's fantastic on the beach, it's on fantastic four-wheel driving and in the mud, and that's great, more power to you. One of the reasons that, you know, I'm not real big on driving this across paddocks is because of the cleanup later. If you get bogged and you leave, you know, a trench this deep, you know, at some point later on, you've got to go fill it in. Because I'm running an orchard, we're not ploughing the fields every single year. You know, if I sink while I'm going around the orchard, You know, that's a you know, a good pothole that I come across when the grass grows later on in spring. I forget about it, drive along, and then crash into this big hole that I'd created in winter and forgot to fill it in. So you got to go back later, and you can really make a mess of things. And particularly with this, while I've never got it bogged, I have made quite a mess of things driving across paddocks and leaving these huge trenches that I've got to go and deal with later on. So my tendency is to use the Hilux, which is just a little bit, you know, it's certainly lighter and has a lot less tendency to make a mess of the paddock. So as I said, it will do it. You know, four-wheel drive high, four-wheel drive low. It's always got me out of things. It does have a tendency to get grass bogged because it's so light out of the end, but that's, you know, getting grass bogged is really no more difficult than whacking it in four-wheel drive and then just creep out of it. That's really not that difficult. But with the Hilux, I find it'll go a lot of places that this won't go before I have to get four-wheel drive in, and that's not surprising. I used to have a TF Rodeo, which was even light, a lot way lighter than my Hilux, and I could drive pretty much anywhere I wanted to go all the time without even engaging four-wheel drive because it was so light. Some good tires on it. You really got stuck. You back in your hubs and away you go. The Hilux is heavier, so it will have a tendency to get stuck a little easier than that old Rodeo did, and this even more so than the Hilux. But if all you're doing is four-wheel driving on tracks and you tear up the track a little bit in your Ram, I mean, you don't have the burden of going back and patching it up. But for me, if I make a mess of my paddocks or my yard or whatever, or my driveway with the Ram, you know, and I did do that earlier in the year where it was one of the first big heavy tenured rains of the year and the driveway got quite sloppy. I ended up putting trenches in my driveway a couple of inches thick, driving up the driveway with a little bit more gusto in the Ram than what I should have. I should have backed it off, taken it a little bit easier. I did make, you know, it was enough of a mess that I had to put the grader blade on the tractor and go and sort the tracks out again. So if you're a farmer and you're considering a Ram, like, as I said, quite capable to a point, but they are a lot heavier. If you've never driven one, they're a lot heavier than what you're used to. And if you're driving them across wet ground, they might make a mess of things for you. So just keep that in mind. If you've got an alternate vehicle, I would suggest you'll probably end up doing what I do. And, you know, in the dead of winter where it is really boggy, you might keep your Ram to the firm ground and your good tracks where you know it's not going to get stuck. And if you need to go around the sheep and that paddock's a little boggy, you'll take something else or whistle the dog and send them out there and get them to bring the sheep to you maybe. So what it's worth, you know, four-wheel drive, if you're in one of these things, one of the best advices I had from a friend of mine, we were coming out of the 10-year kind of millennium drought before I bought the first F250, and a cheap 4x2 came up, and I said to him, do I really need 4x4? Like, we don't seem to get things bogged much anymore. And he said they're so heavy, definitely get the 4x4. And when I got the Effie, I knew exactly what he meant, because they're so heavy, they can have a real tendency to sink quite easily. So you want to just be mindful that they're a vastly different vehicle in terms of dynamics and, you know, what you might be used to if you've only ever driven Australian utes. So that's only my opinion. Feel free to disagree. I'm not saying that they're completely useless four-wheel driving, and I see plenty of people, you know, doing touring in them and up at Fraser Island and such, and they're having a great time in their F250s, and that's fantastic. Good luck to you. But, you know, you're not the ones having to go back probably and regrade things after you tear up the tracks or whatever, particularly if you're four-wheel driving in winter down some boggy tracks. You know, and if you're getting a short wheelbase version as opposed to long wheelbase version, that will make it better for sure. Long base is probably worst case scenario in terms of getting things out of order, but you're still going to be stuck with that heavy front end with a light rear end unless you've got a lot of weight over the back end, and a lot of weight over the back end will help you. If you load it up, you're going to have a lot better success than when I'm driving around completely, which is most of what I do is driving around completely unladen. If you're driving around with a lot of weight in the back, that will certainly help. But again, that's only going to add weight. And if you're going across ground where it might be a bit boggy, that's only going to increase your propensity. It might give you more grip in the back end, but it may increase your propensity to sink. And if you're like me and you're a farmer and you've got to maintain your paddocks, it might increase your propensity to make a huge couple of trenches in your paddocks that you've got to go and clean up later on, or you're going to find yourself very uncomfortable when you go crashing through them when everything's dried out in spring or summer in a few months' time. I hope this video was useful for you. Thanks for watching.